The first strains of Mozart's String Quartet No. 19 drifted across the dusty yard, notes trembling in the hot Arizona air like fragile birds. Prisoners and guards alike froze, heads turning toward the sound. A young Japanese lieutenant named Hiroshi Tanaka drew his bow across violin strings that had been silent since his capture at Guadalcanal. His eyes remained fixed on the sheet music balanced on a makeshift stand, a wooden crate draped with a faded shirt. 3 other prisoners sat beside him, each cradling instruments that seemed impossibly delicate against the backdrop of barbed wire and watchtowers. The guards stood transfixed, rifles momentarily forgotten at their sides. One of them, Sergeant Michael Collins, a former music teacher from Nebraska, took an involuntary step forward, drawn by the familiar melody. For a moment, the war seemed to dissolve in the shimmering heat. These men, separated by language, culture, and the brutal reality of conflict, found themselves united in the universal language of music. What did it mean when enemies could share such beauty amid the ugliness of war? The question hung in the air as clearly as the notes themselves. No one could have predicted how this tentative musical offering would transform Camp Florence, how it would erode the barriers between captive and captor, or how it would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about each other. In the coming months, these impromptu concerts would grow into something that neither American guards nor Japanese prisoners could have imagined when they first regarded each other across the divide of conflict. The story began 6 months earlier when the first wave of Japanese prisoners arrived at Camp Florence in the Arizona desert. They had endured weeks of transport, first on crowded ships across the Pacific, then on trains that cut through the American heartland. Most had never expected to survive capture. The code of Bushido that governed their military lives considered surrender the ultimate disgrace, worse than death itself. Many had attempted suicide rather than face captivity. Those who failed carried not only physical wounds, but the deeper injuries of shame. Among them was Lieutenant Tanaka, his face gaunt from malnutrition, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame. He shuffled off the train with hundreds of others, eyes downcast, expecting the worst. Imperial propaganda had prepared them for torture, humiliation, perhaps even execution. The harsh desert sun beat down as they formed lines outside the camp gates, waiting to be processed. Skin burned and throats parched as the minutes stretched into hours. When the gates finally opened, the prisoners braced themselves. Some whispered final prayers. Others straightened their shoulders, determined to meet their fate with dignity. But what awaited them inside defied all expectations. Rows of clean barracks stretched across the compound. Medical stations had been set up to treat the wounded. Most shocking of all, tables laden with food and water stood ready. Captain Robert Hayes, the camp commandant, addressed them through an interpreter. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated humanely. You will be fed, clothed, and given medical care. Violence against guards will be punished, but you will not be harmed if you follow the rules." The prisoners exchanged confused glances. Was this some elaborate trick? A prelude to some crueler fate? Their suspicion was palpable as they moved through processing. Fingerprinted, photographed, issued new clothes and toiletries. That night in the barracks, hushed conversations circulated. "They want to break our spirit with kindness before the real punishment begins," one sergeant suggested. Others nodded in agreement, too afraid to hope that their captivity might not be the hell they had imagined. What no one could have guessed was that among the personal effects cataloged and stored that day was a violin that would soon become the unlikely catalyst for one of the war's most remarkable cultural exchanges. Nor could anyone have predicted how the sound of that instrument would challenge the very foundations of hatred that had driven these men to opposite sides of a global conflict. The violin remained in storage for weeks while the daily routine of camp life established itself. The prisoners rose at dawn for roll call, ate meals that, while simple, were more substantial than many had received in their final months of combat, and were assigned various work details around the camp. Some cleaned barracks, others worked in the kitchen or laundry. A few with carpentry skills helped repair buildings and furniture. Lieutenant Tanaka kept to himself, speaking little even to his fellow prisoners. The shame of capture had hollowed him out, leaving a shell of the man who had once led infantry charges with unwavering conviction. He moved mechanically through each day, completing assigned tasks with meticulous care but engaging with no one. Guards noted his quiet efficiency but considered him merely another defeated enemy soldier. Until one day, during a routine inspection of personal effects, Sergeant Collins spotted the violin case among the cataloged items. As a music teacher before the war, his interest was immediately piqued. He opened the case carefully, revealing an instrument that had somehow survived the journey from Japan to the battlefields of the Pacific and finally to this desert prison camp. The violin wasn't particularly valuable, a student model with visible wear, but it had been lovingly maintained. Collins lifted it gently, checking the strings and tuning pegs. "Who does this belong to?" he asked the supply clerk. A quick check of the records revealed Lieutenant Tanaka as the owner. Collins was intrigued. He'd never imagined Japanese soldiers, portrayed in propaganda as fanatic warriors devoid of cultural refinement, as musicians. It contradicted everything the war had taught him to believe about the enemy. That afternoon, he approached Tanaka in the yard. The lieutenant stiffened as the American sergeant stopped before him, clutching the violin case. "This is yours?" Collins asked, speaking slowly and gesturing to the case. Tanaka's eyes widened slightly, the first real emotion anyone had seen from him since his arrival. He nodded once, curtly. "You play?" Collins mimicked, drawing a bow across strings. Another nod, more hesitant this time. Collins made a decision that would alter the course of life in Camp Florence. He held out the case. "Play," he said simply. The barracks fell silent that evening as Tanaka opened the case for the first time in months. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the violin, checking it for damage. Finding it intact, he tightened the bow and tested each string, tuning carefully by ear. Other prisoners watched with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. A few guards lingered near the doorway, drawn by the unusual activity. When Tanaka finally placed the instrument under his chin and drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged was startling in its beauty. A Bach partita, played with the skill of someone who had studied for years. The simple barracks with its rough-hewn bunks and bare bulbs seemed to transform, the music carving out a space that transcended captivity. For 4 minutes, no one moved or spoke. When the final note faded, the silence felt almost sacred. Collins broke it first, stepping forward with unconcealed surprise. "That was extraordinary," he said, knowing Tanaka wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Through a prisoner who spoke broken English, Tanaka explained that he had studied violin at the Tokyo Conservatory before the war, preparing for a career as a performer until military service claimed him instead. His violin had been the one personal item he couldn't bear to leave behind, following him from training camps to battlefields, a talisman of a different life. The revelation stunned Collins. Here was a man he had been trained to see as fundamentally different, an enemy combatant who had killed Americans, yet who played the same music Collins himself had taught to high school students in Nebraska. It was the first crack in a wall that would continue to crumble in the weeks ahead. Word of the Japanese violinist spread quickly through the camp. Captain Hayes, initially concerned about allowing a prisoner access to an item that could be considered a privilege, decided to permit Tanaka to practice for 1 hour each evening. "Music isn't a security threat," he told his skeptical officers, "and if it improves morale, all the better." What no one anticipated was how that single hour would expand into something much more significant. 3 days after Tanaka's first performance, another prisoner approached Collins through an interpreter. Private Kenji Watanabe had been a cellist in civilian life. Did the camp perhaps have a cello he could play alongside the lieutenant? There was no cello, but Collins mentioned the request in a letter to his sister in Nebraska. "The strangest thing has happened," he wrote. "I've discovered musicians among our Japanese prisoners. One plays violin at a conservatory level. Another is a cellist. It reminds me that these men had lives before they became soldiers, lives not so different from ours." His sister responded by organizing a collection among the local musicians. Within 3 weeks, a cello arrived at Camp Florence, followed by a viola and a clarinet. Each instrument came with a note expressing hope that music might bring some comfort to those far from home, regardless of which side they had fought on. The arrival of these instruments transformed the evening hour of music. Tanaka was joined by Watanabe on cello, along with a former university student on viola and a jazz enthusiast on clarinet. They began with classical pieces familiar to all of them, Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, their initially tentative collaboration growing more confident with each session. Guards who had once viewed their watch during music hour as a boring assignment now requested the shift. They brought folding chairs outside the barracks, creating an impromptu audience area. Even prisoners who had initially scorned these concerts as collaboration with the enemy gradually drifted over to listen, drawn by the reminder of a world beyond war. Sergeant Collins couldn't stay away. Night after night, he stood at the edge of the growing crowd, sometimes closing his eyes to better absorb the music. One evening, after a particularly moving rendition of Schubert's Ave Maria, he approached Tanaka with a question that had been forming in his mind for days. "I play violin too," he said, gesturing to himself and then the instrument. "May I join you tomorrow?" The request passed through the interpreter, and a ripple of tension ran through both prisoners and guards. This was unprecedented, an American soldier asking to make music with the enemy. Captain Hayes was consulted, regulations reviewed. Finally, permission was granted, though a guard would still need to be present. The next evening, Collins brought his own violin, a well-loved instrument he'd carried from Nebraska. He approached the makeshift quartet with nervous formality, suddenly aware of every uniform insignia marking him as different from these men. Tanaka nodded stiffly, extending a sheet of music. Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a piece accessible enough for a new member to join without extensive rehearsal. Their first notes together were hesitant, each musician hyper-aware of the cultural and military divide separating them. But as the piece progressed, something shifted. The focus narrowed to the music itself, to entrances and dynamics, to the conversation between instruments that Mozart had crafted 2 centuries before either Japanese or American soldiers set foot on the Pacific battlegrounds. By the final movement, they were playing as a true ensemble, responding to each other's subtle cues, building phrases together that none could have created alone. When they finished, the applause came from both sides of the barbed wire, prisoners and guards united in appreciation of what they had witnessed. "Music," Tanaka said in carefully practiced English after the performance, "speaks when words cannot." Collins nodded, understanding flowing between them deeper than language could convey. In that moment, they weren't captor and captive, American and Japanese. They were simply musicians who had found common ground in an unexpected place. News of the unusual musical collaboration spread beyond Camp Florence. An article in the Arizona Republic described enemy musicians finding harmony with American guards, complete with a carefully staged photograph of the quintet, 4 prisoners and Sergeant Collins, playing outside the barracks. Readers sent sheet music and rosin for bows, spare strings and reeds. Most significantly, other guards revealed their own musical backgrounds. Corporal David Martinez had played trumpet in his college marching band. Private First Class William Turner was a competent pianist. Staff Sergeant James Wilson had sung in his church choir. Slowly, cautiously, they joined the evening sessions, bringing instruments from home or borrowing from the collection, growing through donations. What had begun as one prisoner's solitary practice evolved into a chamber orchestra of 20 musicians, 12 Japanese prisoners, and 8 American guards. They played 3 times weekly, rehearsing more ambitious pieces as their collaboration deepened. Dvorak's New World Symphony became a favorite, its themes of homesickness resonating with everyone involved. Captain Hayes, initially concerned about fraternization, found himself persuaded by the positive effects on camp morale. Disciplinary incidents decreased. Cooperation on work details improved. Japanese prisoners who participated in the orchestra began learning English more rapidly, while American guards picked up Japanese phrases. Music had created a bridge where official communication channels had failed. "I never thought I'd say this," Hayes confided to his executive officer, "but these concerts might be the most effective security measure we've implemented. It's hard to plan an escape or start a riot when you're worried about making it to orchestra practice." Not everyone embraced the musical détente. A small faction of prisoners viewed the orchestra members as traitors, collaborating with the enemy that had defeated their beloved homeland. They muttered disapproval in the mess hall, refusing to attend performances. Similarly, some guards complained about coddling the enemy, particularly those who had lost friends or family in the Pacific Theater. Private Masaru Ishii, who had fought at Iwo Jima before his capture, expressed this sentiment directly to Tanaka one night. "How can you play music with the men who would have shot you on sight a few months ago? Have you forgotten your duty to the emperor?" Tanaka considered the question carefully before responding. "I have not forgotten anything," he said quietly, "but I have remembered something even more important, that before we were soldiers, we were human. Music reminds me of this truth." The criticism couldn't halt the orchestra's momentum. By spring of 1944, they had developed a repertoire extensive enough to offer a formal concert. Captain Hayes approved the event, recognizing its potential value for camp relations and possibly even as a propaganda opportunity to demonstrate American humanity toward prisoners. Preparations transformed the camp. A stage was constructed from spare lumber. Programs were printed on the camp's mimeograph machine. Prisoners with artistic talents created posters and decorations. American guards from the orchestra wore their dress uniforms, while Japanese musicians were permitted to clean and press their regulation clothing. The evening of the concert arrived with an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Chairs were arranged in the central yard. Military police discreetly positioned around the perimeter. Local officials had been invited: the mayor of Florence, the county sheriff, and a reporter from the Phoenix newspaper. They sat in a special section, their faces betraying the curiosity and skepticism of people about to witness something unprecedented. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the compound, the orchestra took their places. Sergeant Collins and Lieutenant Tanaka had been selected as co-conductors, alternating pieces throughout the program. The symbolism was lost on no one. Enemy officers leading together, each respecting the other's musicianship, above the conflict that had brought them to this place. The concert began with Bach, stern, mathematical music that demanded precision from every player. It continued through Mozart and Beethoven, the familiar European canon that both American and Japanese musicians had studied in their previous lives. But the true surprise came in the second half, when the orchestra performed pieces from both American and Japanese traditions. The Stars and Stripes Forever, followed by traditional Japanese folk melodies arranged by Tanaka. The finale brought tears to many eyes. Tanaka had composed a piece specifically for this unusual orchestra, titled simply Harmony. It wove together musical themes from both cultures, pentatonic scales and distinctly Japanese rhythmic patterns intertwined with harmonies reminiscent of American folk songs. The composition acknowledged the painful reality that had brought these musicians together while pointing toward a different possibility, one where understanding might eventually replace enmity. As the final chord faded, there was a moment of profound silence before the applause began. It started tentatively, then swelled, audience members rising to their feet in recognition of what they had witnessed. The newspaper reporter was scribbling frantically in his notebook. The mayor was wiping his eyes. Even the military police had been visibly moved. Captain Hayes approached the stage after the performance, shaking hands with each musician, prisoner, and guard alike. "I'm not sure I know what to call what just happened here," he said, "but I think it might be important." He wasn't wrong. The reporter's article, published 2 days later with the headline, "Enemies Make Beautiful Music Together," was picked up by wire services and reprinted in newspapers across America. Photographs of Japanese prisoners playing alongside American guards challenged the dehumanizing propaganda that had defined the Pacific War. Letters poured into Camp Florence from around the country, some critical, calling it treason to collaborate with the enemy, but many more expressing wonder at this unexpected harmony. The War Department took notice. Officials arrived to observe subsequent performances, taking notes on what they termed a novel approach to prisoner management. Other POW camps were encouraged to implement similar cultural programs, though none achieved quite the same level of integration as the Florence Orchestra. For the musicians themselves, the aftermath of their public success brought both opportunity and complication. They were granted additional practice time and better instruments. A piano was delivered to the camp, expanding their repertoire possibilities. But they also faced increased scrutiny, from those who distrusted their motives to those who sought to use their unusual collaboration for propaganda purposes. "We must remember why we are here," Collins told Tanaka during one rehearsal. "This isn't about politics, it's about music." Tanaka nodded, understanding completely. In Japan, we have saying, "Sound of heart carries beyond words." Throughout 1944 and into 1945, as the war in the Pacific intensified, the Camp Florence Orchestra continued its unlikely existence. News of battles reached them: Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each bringing difficult emotions to both sides. Japanese musicians grieved homeland defeats they could do nothing to prevent. American guards received letters about friends killed or wounded in the same battles. Yet somehow, when they gathered with their instruments, these men found a space where present sorrows and past antagonisms could be momentarily set aside. The music demanded their complete attention, requiring a cooperation that transcended the conflict raging thousands of miles away. Private Watanabe expressed it best after a particularly difficult day when news of Tokyo firebombing had reached the camp. "When I play cello, I am not prisoner. I am not even Japanese. I am just musician." This is freedom no war can take. As spring turned to summer in 1945, rumors of the war's imminent end circulated through Camp Florence. The Japanese prisoners, cut off from reliable news sources, clung to hope that their homeland might yet achieve some form of victory, or at least an honorable peace. The American guards, better informed, knew that Japan's defeat was only a matter of time. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Captain Hayes approached Collins and Tanaka with a proposal. "I want the orchestra to prepare a special concert," he said, "something for after the war ends, whenever and however that happens. Music that looks forward, not back." The co-conductors exchanged glances, understanding the captain's unspoken message. This would be music for reconciliation, for the difficult transition from enemies to former enemies, perhaps someday even to allies. They began planning immediately, commissioning new arrangements and compositions from the most talented musicians in their unusual ensemble. No one could have predicted how soon their preparations would be tested. In early August, the world changed forever, with the news of atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's surrender followed days later. For the Japanese prisoners, the news was devastating. The unimaginable defeat of their homeland, the surrender of their emperor, who many had considered divine. The camp fell into a stunned silence. Some prisoners refused to believe the reports, calling them American propaganda. Others sank into deep depression. A few attempted suicide, prevented only by the quick action of guards and fellow prisoners. Orchestra rehearsals were suspended as everyone struggled to absorb the new reality. After a week of uncertainty, Captain Hayes summoned Collins and Tanaka to his office. "Your concert," he said simply. "Now is the time." These men, all of us, need it more than ever. The co-conductors nodded, understanding the urgency. They resumed rehearsals immediately, working with musicians whose hearts were heavy with defeat, but whose fingers still remembered the notes. American guards who had celebrated victory now played alongside Japanese prisoners mourning national catastrophe, finding in music a neutral ground where both emotions could exist without conflict. On a warm September evening, as the desert sky turned crimson, the Camp Florence Orchestra gave its final performance. The yard was filled beyond capacity. Every prisoner, every guard, and dozens of visitors from surrounding communities. Captain Hayes had even arranged for the concert to be recorded for possible radio broadcast. The program began with Bach's Air on the G string, its serene melody floating across the compound like a prayer. It continued through pieces chosen to acknowledge both the suffering and the hope inherent in this moment of transition. Barber's Adagio for strings, Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, and traditional Japanese pieces that spoke of perseverance through hardship. The centerpiece was Tanaka's expanded composition, now titled Reconciliation. He conducted it himself, his thin frame somehow commanding in the fading light. The piece began with discord, instruments in conflict, melodies interrupting each other, before gradually finding resolution. By the final movement, the full orchestra played in perfect unity, building to a conclusion that suggested possibility rather than certainty, the difficult, ongoing work of peace rather than a triumphant victory march. When the final notes faded, there wasn't immediate applause. Instead, a profound silence held the audience, each person absorbed in private reflection. Then, slowly, they rose to their feet. First the American officers, then the Japanese prisoners, finally the civilian visitors, in recognition that they had witnessed something transformative. Captain Hayes stepped forward to address the gathering. "War divides us into enemies," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "But music reminds us of our common humanity. What these men have created together will not end the conflicts between nations, but perhaps it shows us a better way forward." In the weeks that followed, the orchestra members faced a new reality. Repatriation plans were underway for the Japanese prisoners. They would be returning to a homeland transformed by defeat and occupation. The American guards would be demobilized, returning to civilian lives forever changed by their wartime service. The unusual community they had formed would soon disperse across oceans and continents. On his last day at Camp Florence, Lieutenant Tanaka sought out Sergeant Collins. They stood awkwardly in the yard where they had made music together for almost 2 years, now separated by the imminent return to their former roles as citizens of nations only beginning the long process of reconciliation. "I have something for you," Tanaka said, holding out a carefully wrapped package. Inside was his violin, the instrument that had started everything. Collins shook his head. "I can't take this. You'll need it when you return home." Tanaka pressed it into his hands. "I will find another. This one belongs here, with the memory of what we created. Perhaps someday, when wounds of war have healed, I will return to play with you again." They embraced briefly, these former enemies who had discovered friendship through music. No photographs captured this moment, no newspaper reported it. But for those who witnessed it, the image remained indelible. 2 men standing in the shadow of a guard tower, holding between them an instrument of harmony. In the years that followed, the musicians of Camp Florence carried their unlikely experience into a world struggling to rebuild. Some maintained correspondence across oceans and language barriers. Others spoke rarely of what they had shared, finding the experience too profound for casual conversation. A few pursued professional music careers, forever influenced by the unique ensemble that had shaped their wartime years. Sergeant Collins returned to teaching music in Nebraska, bringing to his students not only technique, but a profound belief in music's power to transcend differences. Lieutenant Tanaka eventually established a small music school in Kyoto, where he taught both Western and Japanese traditions to a generation born after the conflict that had defined his youth. The story of the Camp Florence Orchestra faded from public memory, as Cold War tensions replaced World War II in American consciousness. Yet, in personal letters, in family stories, and in the living memories of those who participated, the music they created together remained alive. a testament to the possibility that even in humanity's darkest hours, beauty might still emerge from unexpected sources. Perhaps, in the end, this is the most important legacy of what happened when Japanese prisoners played music and American guards joined the orchestra. Not the concerts themselves, but the enduring reminder that our shared humanity runs deeper than the conflicts that temporarily divide us. As we continue to face a world fraught with division, might we not learn something valuable from those who found harmony in the most unlikely of places?